Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, this is Marcelo.
Hello, Marcelo, welcome. We are just giving it a couple of minutes to let people in.
Ready, Adriana?
Hello, Daniel. Okay, so we are 2 minutes after the start time, so let's go for it. Welcome to everyone. My name is Adriana Allen, and I'm here today wearing two hats, one as president of the Habitat International Coalition, HIC. You will hear many acronyms today. And the second as a member of the UCL Development Planning Unit, or DPU. This event is being co-organized by these two organizations together with IIED, the International Institute for the Environment and Development, and the United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG. The four teams have come together and done enormous work to make this possible. So many thanks to all. Before we start, we're going to do a bit of housekeeping. So perhaps we can look at one of the slides. So I'm sure that this is not your first Zoom meeting and it won't be the last. You probably know the drill very well, but the most important thing is to remind you that we have interpretation available in English, Spanish, and French. So please choose the channel that you need and you will see that. We have circle on the bottom bar, you will see the icon with the globe and you can there choose a language. Yeah, it can be off, English, French, or Spanish. Always remember to keep your micro mute, please, unless you are speaking, and when speaking, if you can, turn on your video. I might have to turn mine off because my connection is quite poor today. Also, we are expecting quite a large audience and we have an amazing line of speakers. So we might not be able to interact with the audience directly, but please do post any reflections, any questions, any comments you have on the chat as the discussion and the presentations progress. And at the end of each block, we're going to come back to any points you're raising and engage with them. So, okay, I'm having to lose my video for now, hoping to be with you on face as well very soon. So before we kick off, I just want to highlight the main aim of today's gathering, which is really to bring together various communities of practice which play a critical role in the realization of housing rights. Some of you do so by reframing what housing rights mean today, others advancing their realization by claiming or producing them on the ground. It is, I think, worth reminding ourselves that we are having this conversation at a critical and pivotal point in history. And this is not only marked by the way in which the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the fore the fundamental role that housing plays in the protection of life, and also the strong reemergence of race and gender as two crucial dimensions in the realization of housing rights. Today, I think we are also forced to rethink housing rights in light of two massive global challenges, which are deeply interconnected. On the one hand, clearly and without doubt, the increased financialization of housing, a machine that sees trillions of dollars invested in residential property across the globe, deepening housing needs and driving up wealth inequality, a story we know. What is more shocking is that this process continues to be subsidized through tax breaks and bank bailouts, while we see in parallel public spending on social housing being slashed. Unregulated global capital has, in recent years, not only distorted housing markets all over the world to a level that now excludes and expels poor and middle-income families from what are regarded as prime locations, but it has also increased housing precariousness on an unprecedented scale. On the other hand, the intersection between climate change and housing rights presents two formidable challenges. First, tackling the heavy contribution of the construction sector to global emissions, which adds another layer of challenges to how housing deficits and the maintenance of existing social housing are approached. This, I would argue, urges us to explore ways not just of building, but also of retrofitting, repairing, rehabilitating, and redeploying existing housing stocks. Second, by confronting the massive wave of forced evictions and displacement that are being exacerbated and executed worldwide in the name of risk. Paradoxically, this process is justified as a means to protect life, but in reality, what we see is a process of clearing the land in economically profitable spots to make place for speculative real estate developments. The right to housing and to adequate housing, actually, was recognized as part of the right to an adequate standard of living back in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is 72 years ago. Now, housing rights, of course, have been reinforced over the years by several international conventions and by the increased recognition of what Sean Turner several decades ago called the process of housing by the people, further propelled by the International Year of Shelter for the Homeless in 1987 and the subsequent global strategy to shelter to the year 2000. We see housing rights becoming over time prominent on the human rights agenda of the United Nations, but not only. Further significant layers of progress towards the actual realization of housing rights on the ground were also driven simultaneously by many of the networks present in this meeting, HIC, SDI, and ICHR among them. But still today, we witness large masses of the urban poor push into a state of what we could call bare or unhoused citizenship. Housing rights are now more than ever at the fore of the struggles we face and increasingly endangered through all and new machines of massive evictions, displacement, and dispossession. Yet we also witness the consolidation and emergence of multiple ways of activating housing rights as actual entitlements. In recent months, we have seen this happening through massive wall changes. And I think in the context of COVID-19, this has involved, not everywhere, but in many contexts, sweeping measures to tackle homelessness, to redeploy existing housing, set up rental and mortgage holidays, suspend evictions, and so forth. But a critical question in this sense is how to sustain, deepen, and expand these measures beyond the pandemic. Housing rights can not only be protected under emergency conditions, that is clear to all. I want to reiterate the fact that 2020 marks a very particular moment. This is the 75th anniversary of the UN system and also marks 2 decades since the first UN Special Rapporteur for Housing Rights was appointed. This year offers a moment of critical reflection about the international infrastructure we rely on the one hand, for the defense of housing rights, and the mushrooming efforts securing the realization of those rights on the ground. This, I would say or argue, is a key moment to reflect collectively on what works and what needs to change, and hence the point of this meeting. So in looking back, we ask what has changed in the way we're approaching housing rights. In looking forward at the actual tactics we deploy in claiming and producing housing rights, we ask how are our responses to advance housing rights evolving or forced to evolve? We have an amazing line of speakers to reflect on these 2 questions. So without further delay, I would like to give the floor to Emilia Sais, Secretary General of UCLG, and a crucial ally in the struggle to firm housing rights, again, strongly on the agenda. Emilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adriana, and greetings, colleagues from the different parts of the world. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for acknowledging me as an ally. We, local and regional governments, the constituency that I represent, we also know that we are part of the problem. So we are part of the problem, and I think a critical ally in the solution. And since the panel that I'm going to facilitate is a panel about what has changed and transformation. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview from our perspective, from the perspective of local and regional governments, from the international umbrella of local and regional governments. We have started to see, and this is always in the perspective of change. I mean, housing has always concerned us from the perspective of urbanization, urban mobility, slums. This was the part that was really critical for us in the international arena as a constituency. And then slowly, we have started to realize that our main problem was the commodification. And it was a problem not only for the communities that our constituency needs to serve, the citizens, the inhabitants, but it was also, it has also become a problem for the local and regional governments themselves, because commodification has been something that has also affected the local, the sphere of government. If the people see housing sometimes just as a good that they can buy as an investment, we have also perceived from our constituency land where you build houses, etc., like Adriana was explaining, as a very big source of income as well. And this has been a very critical issue that is also behind evictions. We have gone through a period in which we were seen very much also as a technical sphere of government, as a technical level of government that needed to look at technical solutions for things. And that was also the prisma that we were using for the housing issue. Obviously, I am simply oversimplifying because there are different cases in the world that many of you know well. But this was the general approach of our movement to this, with some very critical exceptions. I think then that the global financial crisis came and really changed our prisma of this, because it became an issue not only of the global south, but also very much of the global north. The whole process towards the Habitat 3 agenda has marked us and our alliance with more clear alliance with civil society. And now COVID is here. And this pandemic has also put this magnifying glass in the type of problems that we had. So while there have been champions in our constituency that have always seen housing from the perspective of rights, I have to confess that having worked with local governments for over 20 years, this was not the majority of our movement. I think this is the change that we can perceive, and this is what is behind the Cities for Adequate Housing a coalition that we have built up, and some of the critical political demands that many local governments around the world are making. This is also why United Cities and Local Governments is very keen to partner with you, with everybody here in this room, and sees housing as a very critical cornerstone of any future agenda for development. So it is from that perspective that I would like to look at the discussion, and building on your extensive experience on the matter, I would like to focus on that. What is changing in this narrative? I think that the change of narrative is very important. We shouldn't be stopping there. Is there change? Are we right about it or not? Raquel, the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, needs no introduction. Is this the way that you are experiencing this? Do you see an evolution? Do you see a change in the way that we are approaching housing rights?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, who knows what time is it. Thank you so much for this invitation and for the privilege of sharing this panel with you, with some friends, and for the initiative. Unfortunately, I think that my intervention is not very optimistic, but let me just phrase that the framework of right to housing as part of the general view that rights refer not only to civic political rights, but also to economic, social, and cultural rights, the so-called second generation of rights. That whole idea came together, was part of a large package which included and was centered on the welfare state. So the idea of a central role for the state to promote economic, social, and cultural rights, and also international cooperation, because we are talking about an international level as well. And all this conception led to promoting and a very important role for the state to promote and provide housing as a promoter and as a very active promoter in very different ways, using different strategies. But that started to be absolutely dismantled. That was dismantled, and the temporalities are very different from country, from region to the other region. But we can see, and it's very clear how much we witnessed that at the end of the 70s or 80s or 90s, and it's still an ongoing process in some countries, ongoing process of dismantling not only the welfare state as it was, but also the ideas and the conceptions that fed the idea of a welfare state. And that includes the right to adequate housing as a human right and other socioeconomic rights. So the whole movement of privatization and commodification of housing, of education, of health, this is a part of an ongoing process that, yes, we all know that led to an acute housing crisis everywhere. You could say, oh yes, the welfare state was a reality in countries here in the center of capitalism and also in the experiences of socialism, but not in the periphery of capitalism in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. Yes, it's true, but also it was a dream. It was a utopia that was there. And that utopia also was very important politically. That also was dismantled everywhere. And the transformation of housing into a commodity and into a financial asset became the main motto, not only of the private sector of housing providers, but also of public policies. So local governments and national governments, regional governments were active promoters of the financialization of housing and still are. So this is very important because that had different phases, promoting home ownership, privatization of public housing, no more building public housing, and mortgage, and this side of the policies. But also now, after the 2008 crisis and the whole clash and the housing crisis that came together with the clash of financialization of housing, now we have the new wave of financialization of housing, which is rental housing. And again, and again, local governments and national governments promoting rental housing. Again and again, the international cooperation promoting the idea that now rental housing is the issue and we have to have corporate landlords to enter into the sector, among other policies. So in order not to stop here with this tragic picture, I would say that there is one very important change. And the change I see is in the level of the civil society or the ones who are affected by the financialization of housing. And that I include all the housing social movements that existed long before in the periphery of capitalism, fighting and struggling for housing, who had in fact incorporated more and more the framework of right to housing into their practices, but also the emergence, and this is very interesting, the emergence of a new wave and a new generation of housing movements in places where this didn't exist for many decades. And then, yes, I am referring to several countries in Europe and cities in Europe, in the United States, who are now seeing an emergence of a new generation of a social movement, which again, it's incorporating the right to housing into the framework. This is the hope. Okay. This is what can bring change to this picture.
Okay, Raquel. So hope, change and hope in the level of readiness and the capacity of the civil society movements, and stagnation and wrong policies in the sides of governments a bit. That's where your main concerns lie. Let us go and see whether Ruth identifies with some of these things, or whether from your perspective there is another way of looking at this. Any change to be identified, and pick up on Raquel as well. Do you identify with this increasing empowerment of civil society?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. It's caused me to reflect on my history at some length. And I think I'd actually like to go back to that a little bit, because we've been talking about what's been learnt from the previous history, and where does that move forward. And I think I first got involved in 1980 by going in and hanging out in a community of people who had captured land on a hillside in Jamaica. And I learned a lot from them about how they were financing things, how they were dealing with the land, how they were building. And I got kind of angry about quite a lot of that stuff. And one thing led to another. And a few years later, I found myself going to a UN conference, but trapped in a taxi with my Minister of Housing. And I hadn't had that experience before. And I think I started spouting, you need to sort this out, you need to sort that out, we need to have land, we need to da. And eventually he sort of stopped, he was very polite, and he said, I totally agree. Could you please tell me how? And when I look back at the history, I went back and I reread the Limuru Declaration, which was the declaration that led to the reformulation of Habitat International Coalition in 1987. And it's a terrific document. It realigned things in all sorts of ways, and the International Year of Shelter for the Homeless brought a whole generation of civil society activists together over that year. But if you look at the documentation, it is full of shoulds and musts and things that people have to do. But there is very, very little about how to do it. And I think my experience with many of the colleagues with whom I worked over especially the 19 or 20 years that I was at Homeless International, was that we worked in relationships to work on the how. And we didn't spend a lot of time talking about rights, except when we were part of one delegation or another to UN Habitat, and we needed to engage with that language. What we were very concerned about was the processes and the mechanisms and the techniques, if you like, of actually making a difference. And Homeless International, which I work with, particularly focused on finance, because there were lots of civil society initiatives and they were terrific and they did marvelous things in mobilizing people, but they had a real issue in terms of scaling up. And the scaling up was a problem, not just about mobilizing people, which many organizations did very successfully through people's movements and generating a whole voice, if you like, about the issues. But there were problems in basic access. There was an issue about accessing land, and there was an issue about accessing finance, let alone technical capacity to actually package all that stuff together in the complexity that large scale interventions require. And I think what those of us who were involved in the first establishment of the International Guarantee Fund, and then in arguing the case for an international venture capital fund that would directly access people living in informal settlements, slums, whatever you want to call them, to the kind of development finance they needed to take a real lead role in settlement development. We had to engage with other people. We had to engage with banks and learn their language. We had to find techniques to put our foot in the door and keep that door open. And it was a long and it was a painful experience. And some of it led to real breakthroughs and a significant scaling. And an awful lot of it didn't, because there were constraints in terms of technical capacity to do things. There were constraints in terms of the banking sector wasn't developed. I mean, I can remember going to Cambodia and visiting Phnom Penh and visiting the only bank and the only bank manager and saying, well, would you be prepared to finance settlement upgrading? And he just laughed in my face. You know, he said, don't be ridiculous. You know, we're just trying to establish a financial sector here. So clearly, the financial markets have developed in all sorts of ways with globalization. And there's been a huge emphasis on the whole infrastructure that lies behind financialization and so forth. But the majority of people that we were dealing with then, and we're, you know, and people are, and people facing the phones are still outside of that. They don't have access to those services, and they don't have formal and legal access to that land. So they're indirectly, if you like, affected by the financialization because the subsidies are being grabbed for other purposes. And so I asked
Ruth, may I ask you one question so that you use your last minute and help us reflect on this? I think this how approach is extremely interesting. What I am wondering is if you would need to do the same thing, if you would come into this ecosystem now, like you came in before, would it be very different what you would be doing?
I think what I would do now is basically be much more rigorous about understanding the initiatives that have come up from the ground that have actually managed to scale up and work. And I know of a number of those that have been partially documented, but they have not been properly analysed and understood in terms of the financial processes involved and the level of capital that some of those community-based and driven processes have generated is enormous. I mean, it's millions and millions and millions of dollars that is circulating within civil society financial networks. And a lot of it's not even known about. And so I think there's a need to really understand what people like Sonia, who's going to be speaking later, have done, what's happened with the whole sort of Federation in India experience, what's happened with an organization I started with very early, IVDP. Get that knowledge out so that people can understand the strategic output, if you like, of the relationships that those organizations have formed, how they did it, and what what they've learnt in
Thanks.
terms of what works.
No, thank you very much for this perspective. I was looking at the chat, and I'm not surprised that it comes from someone from local government. I think that sometimes the challenges that we see, and I am biased in how I look at this, because of course I work with an sphere of government, a certain constituency. We face the trouble that yeah, affordable housing might never be competitive. I say might, although Eduard, who might be taking the floor later, says will never be competitive. I mean, might not ever be competitive. So I think we also need to look at it from this perspective, and this is why I think looking at it from the perspective of rights is very, very important. That you will, otherwise you will not cover this universal need that we all have, and that is so basic for humanity and for human decency. So Ruth, keep this in mind, and I will come back to you in a second. Allow me now to go to Diana, principal researcher in International Institute for Environment and Development. And Diana, since you have heard already two other speakers, allow me then to ask you the same question, but ask you also to build on some of the issues that have been brought up before.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we were just trying to work out if you're going to see any slides or not. I'd prepared two. I'm not sure it's practical now. But good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you also for the invitation. Incredibly exciting to be with you. I will try and build, of course, on what's been said before. I'm very appreciative of Adriana highlighting some of the key challenges. Also, Amelia, of you talking a little bit about the role and significance of local government. If I remember my sequencing without my photos, I might reference that. And I guess Raquel and Ruth, you provided a set of perspectives, I think, around the challenge to the welfare state and the challenge to rights, Raquel, but also the need to be really pragmatic in how we move forward. So we were asked to reflect on what's changed in the way we're approaching rights. And I wanted to flag two ideas. Thank you, that was super swift of UCLG. I really wanted to flag two ideas. Raquel moved from being pessimistic to optimistic. Apologies, I fear I will do the reverse. So I fear I will move from being optimistic to pessimistic. So I think the first trend I wanted to pick up on, and I would say neither of these trends are new. I think both of them were established some decades ago, but I think they are being strengthened. So I think that the language is changing. I think that we have moved away perhaps from a focus on rights, but the movements, the urban social movements have moved to a focus on justice. And that seems to me to be important and significant. And I think in my mind, it reflects the fact that it can be easy to get governments to sign up to rights. Words are easy, changing practice is hard. And I'm going back almost to the mid-90s, I think, when talking to Alejandro Florien in Colombia, and he spoke about the movement's struggle to get the right to housing and the subsidy system in Colombia, but the feeling that it didn't address what was needed, really for the reason Ruth highlighted, the lack of scale. So I think movements have understood that justice cannot be achieved simply by rights, that rights are important, but we need to go beyond rights to a realization of rights. I think that reflects the fact that movements have caught up with the fact that states are sophisticated, movements need to be sophisticated too. And I think there has been something of a frustration around social movements. Maybe Roseanne Sonia will comment on this. Something of frustration with academics, professionals, NGOs, who fall into the trap of asking for superficial change, but not substantive political reform. So that is my optimistic reading of how approaches have changed, that we understand more than rights is required, and we have in some sense, aligned to do that. This is actually a photo from Zimbabwe, from Bulawayo, about the Zimbabwe, and it shows the Zimbabwe Homeless People's Federation working with groups of people to challenge evictions in dialogue with local government and securing something that's better. Okay, if we could just go to the next slide. Emilia, I only have 2 slides. Please don't be alarmed. Okay, so the second trend I wanted to really highlight talks directly to Raquel's assessment. And we didn't collude, so please, participants, don't feel it's set up. So I think one of the ways in which government has responded to pressure to address the right to housing is through housing opportunities that are in many cases unaffordable. So this is a picture actually from Pune, and it reflects a response that the National Slum Dwellers made to a government program, Basic Services for the Urban Poor. So as movements pressed governments to address housing rights, and governments rolled out programs to address housing rights, in many cases, they were about incorporating low-income populations into a housing market. So in this case, actually quite a big subsidy. The Pune example worked relatively well, 90% subsidy. The Federation was able to support people to enter. In other places like Vizag, it was really a very hostile program where community low-income people had to take big loans that they probably could not afford to repay. So I think that as there has been efforts to realize the right to housing, one response has been this marketization, even before you get to financialization. And I think we have got to realize that affordability has to be a contested agenda. Affordability is used absurdly as a euphemism. Affordable houses are not affordable in any sense. And we have to remember that when we talk about the affordability of housing, it is not simply housing and housing finance. It is water, sanitation, drainage. It is a whole bundle of services, which in too many cases are not affordable to the lowest income groups. So this is the pessimistic perspective. I wanted to really end with a bit of a challenge. I don't think our approach has moved far enough to contesting affordability as a concept and to contesting the way in which we are developing a set of solutions to address housing needs. So I want to finish there. I've thrown out my 2 ideas for what they're worth. And I just wanted to thank the organizers again for providing this platform for us to engage with these really critical themes.
Well, thank you very much. I think we all have the hope to continue these deliberations and to make sure that this kind of conversation also feed on concrete proposals to different actors on how to pursue this agenda. I think that's certainly why United Cities and Local Governments is here, and I am sure this is the case also for other partners in this event. As I give the floor to our discussants, I would like to just leave this in the room. I think it might be answers also in other panels. But I think we need to start also asking very concrete questions about the tools that we have in front of us. I mean, for a very long time, local governments have been left out of the conversation because it simply was not in the realm of competencies. Housing still is not in many cases. And what I am wondering now is whether we can achieve this affordability, justice, upscaling discourse, which I truly think is built on rights, by, for instance, promoting tools like public housing. Is public housing the answer, really? Is that what local governments need to be pushing for, or not, or is that wrong? I think there are many concrete questions like that our membership, our local governments are struggling with, and they might be making also the wrong investment and asking the wrong things to the national governments and to the private sector that they partner with. So I hope we can discuss some of that. But allow me to give the floor now to Arif Hassan, founder of the Urban Resource Center in Pakistan, to provide some reactions to what we have heard up until now, and obviously bring in some new ideas. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Can you hear
There
me?
you are. I can see you now. Wonderful.
You can see me also. Good, great.
Go ahead.
Well, there were so many things that were said, and I think I don't need to say anything. Diana has more or less summed them up. But I will sort of talk about my experiences somewhat and the situation as it has evolved in the countries where I have worked, and there are remarkable similarities. First of all, Raquel's comment that the welfare state has been dismantled. I think that is universal. The welfare state has been dismantled, yes, but his ideas still linger on. The desire for it is still there. And it's very much a part of thinking of policymakers as well. It's also put down in documents on housing. However, in the actual practice of housing, it does not figure. And so it is very much something that is still there. It's not really finished. I think a very important point was raised by Ruth, and that is the constraints that are imposed by the nature of banking, its rules, regulations, the manner it functions, how it functions, its linkages. And that denies access to housing finance. So that is one area where there is a necessity of major interventions, but it's the most difficult thing to do because these are well-established institutions of a global nature and perhaps the most conservative of institutions. But apart from that, there are other aspects which I would like to point out. Before, we were trying to establish that there was something known as housing rights. And this was very much so in the 70s, I think, that there is such a thing, which was not accepted as something that existed. And this was because housing rights were there as a concept because of various advocacy groups rather than really projects as such that were establishing themselves at that time. And so the concept of housing rights, I think, is very present in academia, in civil society, in government policymakers. But the question is, why cannot this concept that is promoted again, like in my university as well, why can it not become a part of policy? Why cannot these successful projects that have been carried out, why do they remain simply as projects? And even if changes are made in them, in policy, that is limited to a certain area, that is limited to a certain arrondissement, to a certain district, rather than for the whole country. And I think the constraints to turning these into policy and upscaling them, I think they need to be recognized. It should not be, I think as Ruth was saying probably, should be, must be, no. The reason is, why is it not so? And for that, the understanding of who does what, how, and why becomes necessary. And this factor, I think in most, a very important factor is missing in most researchers. It's rather working towards an ideal rather than dealing with these very important questions of how housing is delivered, what for, what is behind it. Today, it's the market. It has been decided almost everywhere. Even in a city like Karachi, which is a poor city, the majority of housing today at enormous costs is delivered by the developers. And the subsidies that are provided for that housing, they are the main beneficiaries of that. And I think this trend is going to increase with the passage of time as the state withdraws from the entire housing delivery systems.
Thank you, Arif.
Sorry?
You need to wrap up.
I'm wrapping up. So,
good.
In my understanding of things, we have to have a very different approach to understanding housing. I think what we need to understand is the present situation and how it functions, because we are not going to do away with it like this. That understanding is crucial. And it has to be related to the global economic system and how it is evolving and affecting our societies and our country. I feel increasingly in the case of Pakistan that we have a public that is aware, that understands what the issues are. Larger coalitions need to be formed that can, some way or the other, affect policy making, that can affect government functioning. But for that, the necessary knowledge to understand the relationships that exist in producing the situation as it is today, I feel is very essential. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arif, for these words that actually build on many of the issues that the different speakers have raised. And from my perspective and what I have been hearing from you is that maybe we understand the housing crisis differently from if you look at it from different perspectives. My sense for a very large part of my membership for local governments around the world, the housing crisis has been understood as a financial crisis and not a human rights crisis or an injustice issue. And that is exactly what we need to change. And I sense, I am a little bit positive on this, I might be wrong, but I sense that for my membership, that is what is starting to change. That we are understanding that very differently in different parts of the world. You've always had those that got it right. Huh? So I do hope that we can progress down that path. I think it is important to change the narrative, to actually change the actions and the policies. I am afraid I've been a very bad moderator because we've gone too far with all the comments, but it was impossible to stop you all. I mean, very interesting comments. Thank you for counting on us, for keeping local governments in mind. And I give it back to you, Adriana, to go with the next session. Thank you for this opportunity. And thank you to all the speakers for the wonderful inputs.
Thank you so much, Emilia. I will keep comments for the end. Thanks a lot to all the speakers. I see some interesting and even, provocations and even some intention, but definitely a lot of food for thought. I know we are a bit behind. To the audience, please keep on adding any comments, any questions on the chat, and we will, if we catch up a bit more with time, we will try to engage with your voice directly. But I don't want to delay more to give the floor to Barbara, my colleague Barbara Lipietz. So what we are doing now is we are moving into an exploration that we don't want to polarize. I think that, we're saying that, claiming rights or using the rights language and realizing them on the ground are equally important and extraordinarily necessary together. It's not that you opt for one or the other. But we thought, well, let's start by, exploring in more detail. If we dive into how we are working on the claiming rights on the ground, not at the United Nations, then, what are our tactics? What is working, what is not, and what needs to change? Barbara, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Adriana, and thank you very much to our first speakers who've really set the scene. Very interesting, actually, to hear the way in which that scene was put forward, both stories of shifts, but actually it seems more like inflection in big structural trends in the ways in which housing is being conceived increasingly as a commodity, less and less as a home as a means for living or as a means of being, actually. But actually we saw, and Diana showed how actually that was a long process in the making. Also very interesting to see that conversation around the ways in which the response by social movements, by communities has been changing, and interesting to think about this shift in the framings of that Diana seemed to indicate, a shift from rights to justice. So I think maybe that might talk to this issue that you were raising, Adriana, about actually the interesting interaction between the claiming of rights and the realization of rights. And I think that's something that we're going to be talking to in the next two panels. So here what is very nice in the panel that comes is we are going to be exploring these issues with four very different speakers who come from different actors, if you want, and amongst actors who are fighting for housing rights. We have, on the one hand, Hilary Zhao from social movements. We'll have people who are intermediary organization. I'm thinking of Danielle Nons in particular. And then we also will have the voice of local authority. So, and what's going to be interesting, I think, for us to think about is the way in which there are convergence amongst at least some of these. So maybe we're bringing a bit more optimism in this panel. So to start with, I'm really very happy to welcome on this panel Hilary Zhao, who is the national coordinator from the Zimbabwe People's Land Rights Movement. So the Zimbabwe People's Land Rights Movement works across urban and rural areas, and particularly in these very conflictual areas that are peri-urban spaces. Working across housing and land rights, I think also, which is an issue which was raised earlier on. And at the moment, very preoccupied with issues around evictions. I think the Zimbabwe People and Lands Rights Movement has done a record of eviction, and there's at least been 740,000 people forcibly evicted since the launch of the land reform program in 2000. And that's the reported one. So anyway, Hilary is right in the thick of trying to claim and act in favor of housing rights. Hilary, I have two questions for you. In this context, what have been particularly useful or effective tactics for claiming rights or defending housing rights? And the second one, I think we're in a sympathetic environment here, so we can talk about the challenges and try and help each other in thinking about these challenges. So what have been tactics that have been less successful, and why is that? And how do you think that tactics for claiming rights may need to evolve? So thank you, Hilary. Hilary, maybe you need to unmute.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you so much. Greetings to everyone. I think I'll just have to go right straight to the point because I don't have much time to I have a lot to say. So basically what we have been doing, what is our down to top approach, where we are educating the grassroots, educating the community in the areas where we work, both in the urban areas and also in the rural areas, which are mostly in the rural areas where we mostly work on land rights. So basically education of grassroots on their rights so that they can be able to be in a position to know their rights and also be able to claim their rights and also be able to seek redress of violations through the proper channels. We are also working. Working on engaging with the various states, the various arms of the state, which is the legislature, that is the parliament, and also government line ministries, in terms of lobbying for policy reforms, lobbying for policies that are favorable in terms of housing and land rights are concerned. And then thirdly, we have been also using media. How so? We have been through our through the violations database, and we are trying to, every time we hear of an incident of a violation, the moment we publicize that violation, the moment we broadcast it, whether on our social media or we engage with our maybe sister or sympathetic journalists who work with us, whenever an issue is highlighted in the newspapers on social media, we make this immediate kind of a retreat or immediate you could see immediate results from if issues are publicized, because both the perpetrators will now be on the limelight, and it will be very much impossible for them to continue with their violations, and also assist us in our interventions. So going to the next question, since I don't think I have much time, we would go into what are the challenges we have been facing in terms of trying to achieve our goals. Firstly, there is a lack of policies and laws which support and promote, and protect housing and land rights. And for land rights, currently our government is working on a land policy, which means there are no, currently there are no, we do not have a land policy that is maybe 20 years after the land reform. We still do not have a land policy which guarantees security of tenure, which protects habitats, which protects housing rights also. On the housing rights sector, I think there is a policy on that, but then there is an issue of highly politicization of both these sectors, that is the housing and also the land sector. Going forward, I think there's also a lack of knowledge by mostly the victims of housing and land rights violations. They would not know that in violated, it is something which they take action. Most cases, some of these cases go unreported, so they go on, and there's basically no intervention or redress which takes place, because basically the victim doesn't know that he or she has been victimized. So also going forward, I think the issue of politicians, corruption is one of those major issues which we are also facing. Political parties, especially the ruling parties, they take advantage of being in power, and then use their political powers and political offices to whether be it allocate land for housing or land for farming or subsistence farming or local family farming. So this is one of the major problems we are facing as a movement. Also, there is also a lack of clear, in the
Larry,
global
we
arena,
need to
a clear.
move soon. So if you don't mind just being very quick in closing.
Okay. Okay, yeah, just in closing, there is generally a lack of a standalone human right to land, which is one of the major hurdles which we are facing as a land rights and housing rights movement, basically, which leads also to the lack of policies which support these structures, which supports the right to land particularly. And then also, basically, I think like any other organization, we are facing maybe we might say financial challenges in terms of supporting our programs. And also international solidarity is very low because of how maybe the land reform in Zimbabwe took place. So basically, I think I would conclude.
Okay, thank you very much, Hilary, to raise these really crucial issues of both the complexities of operating in a context where the institutional and regulatory system is either not very well developed, but also being highly politicized, but also to show the ways in which you're using a variety of tactics. The media in particular is a really interesting one, and one that a number of organizations are developing extremely well. So thanks for raising that. I'd like to take the floor now to a colleague from Cameroon, Daniel Nonz, who is the General Program Coordinator of l'Association des Amoureux du Livre pour le Développement Local, the Association of Book Lovers for Local Development, or ASOAL, who is operating in a quite similar context, but from as an intermediary. So ASOAL is an NGO that works, who is very embedded in mobilizations for housing rights and land rights and general civic education. But plays that role of linking with community groups and also trying to find the kinds of allies that Hilary was talking about that are so essential for actually realizing rights. So Daniel, please, s'il vous plaît. C'est bon, Daniel. Merci. Ton micro est allumé, est fermé.
Ok, je m'excuse pour le désagrément. Je disais tantôt que les échanges ont très bien commencé, tout est intéressant. ASOAL, c'est comme Barbara l'a dit, c'est une organisation de la société civile camerounaise qui a été créée en 1996 et légalisée en 2000, qui travaille sur deux axes thématiques essentiels, à savoir la gouvernance locale, la décentralisation, ça c'est le premier axe. Le second axe porte sur la promotion des DEX. Sur les DEX, nous travaillons beaucoup sur la protection des droits économiques, sociaux et culturels. Et l'un des droits les plus importants sur lequel on est concentré, c'est le droit au logement. Dans un contexte où, qui est caractérisé par un nombre important sur le coût élevé des logements, autant que moi je vous l'ai dit, il y a les logements qui sont construits et les coûts varient construits par l'État, entre 25 millions et 30 millions. Il est aussi caractérisé par le développement des évictions forcées et des accaparements des terres, parfois pour des causes d'utilité publique ou pour la réalisation de grands projets. Et notre stratégie se justifie par l'éloignement aussi des structures d'accès aux droits dont je voudrais parler un peu des palais de justice et des cabinets de conseil. Il est aussi caractérisé par le coût élevé des prestations judiciaires et juridiques, c'est-à-dire que lorsque les populations ont besoin de conseils, ça coûte plus cher lorsqu'il faut absolument aller rencontrer un juge ou un avocat. Alors, je voudrais passer directement, je sais que le temps est très court, sur la stratégie développée par ASOAL. La première stratégie porte sur la mobilisation, la formation issue des communautés que nous accompagnons. Elle va s'enchaîner avec la réalisation des enquêtes sociales pour mieux cerner les impacts des évictions forcées sur les communautés en cas d'éviction. Et ça, on réalise des enquêtes sociales pour avoir ces informations. Une fois que c'est fait, nous allons passer à la documentation des cas. C'est-à-dire qu'on va documenter chaque cas pour avoir des informations exactes. Parce que lorsqu'il faut aller au dialogue ou alors il faut aller défendre le cas, on a besoin des informations qui présentent au plus petit détail chaque cas identifié. Après la documentation des cas, on va mettre en place une stratégie. On a mis en place une association, l'association des volontaires pour la cartographie participative. Cette association va nous aider de mettre sur une carte, de situer sur une carte chaque cas, chaque communauté victime ou potentielle victime des évictions forcées. Alors, après cette étape, nous allons passer à la réalisation des cartes participatives. C'est-à-dire que les volontaires que nous avons formés vont réaliser les cartes de chaque communauté. Actuellement, on est en une vingtaine de communautés que nous accompagnons. Alors, après avoir réalisé les cadres, nous allons passer à la structuration des communautés en collectif. Les communautés victimes ou potentiellement victimes des évictions forcées ou d'accaparement des terres. On va les accompagner à se structurer en association pour mieux défendre leurs droits. Alors, puisque parfois l'un des problèmes des citoyens, c'est le manque d'information, nous avons un outil qui s'appelle Université itinérante citoyenne. C'est le caravane citoyenne pour amener le citoyen à mieux maîtriser ce qui est prévu en termes de loi. Parce que pour aller revendiquer, il faut savoir ce qui est prévu et veiller à ce que ce qui est prévu soit appliqué. Donc, on va mener ces campagnes qui sont organisées dans chaque communauté accompagnée. Alors, après cette étape-là, nous allons passer à la mise en place des balcons de droit et d'éducation à la citoyenneté. C'est une sorte d'espace créé dans des communautés en question où les parajuristes formés, les juristes professionnels ou des médiateurs qu'on a formés seront auprès des communautés pour les accompagner, par exemple, peut-être pour la rédaction des plaintes, pour des conseils juridiques, qui peuvent aussi les accompagner en justice au cas où c'est nécessaire. Donc, l'accompagnement des communautés va porter essentiellement sur la médiation, sur l'accompagnement administratif, juridique et judiciaire. Alors, c'est clair que si on veut réaliser l'accompagnement, même s'il est juridique ou judiciaire, on a, comme Baba l'a dit, besoin des alliés au niveau des institutions. Donc, on a une bonne stratégie de lobbying qui nous permet, si on travaille avec le ministère en charge de la gestion de foncier au Cameroun, on a besoin d'avoir des alliés intérieurs qui vont nous donner parfois de la documentation qui n'est pas accessible à tous, même si elle est publique. C'est parfois trop compliqué si on veut l'avoir. Donc, mais si vous avez des alliés, vous allez facilement les avoir. Et ça nous permet d'avoir des informations.
Merci Daniel. On doit...
Il y a un autre outil que nous utilisons, c'est l'organisation des tribunaux populaires des élections. C'est une sorte de tribunal que nous organisons parce que l'accès au procès n'est pas facile. On va donc simuler un tribunal avec un jury pour permettre aux personnes qui sont victimes de pouvoir s'exprimer. Et à l'occasion, on va mobiliser des institutions en charge, et parfois pour ceux qui sont à l'origine des violations des droits, pour les sensibiliser et qu'ils prennent conscience de la situation et de l'impact aussi de ces évictions sur les communautés. Donc, et une fois que c'est fait, on a fait ça, il y a une activité la dernière, je crois, c'est l'élaboration de rapports alternatifs sur le droit au logement qu'on réalise chaque année. Ça, c'est pour mobiliser la communauté internationale autour de ces cas de violation des droits au logement qui sont connus un peu partout. Donc, pour finir, on a quand même quelques défis. Hein. L'un des défis, c'est le passage à l'échelle de la mise en œuvre de notre stratégie, la mobilisation des ressources humaines et financières, la mobilisation aussi des communautés et l'accès à la terre pour produire les modèles de logement que nous avons pu élaborer. Voilà en quelques mois, en quelques minutes, ce que je pourrais dire par rapport à ce qui m'a été demandé. Merci.
Okay, so I'll go back to English. Thank you very much, Daniel, for this very interesting presentation, which shows the multiple scales at which ASOAL is working, and also the very interesting and different tactics that are used, but which require always engagement with multiple actors. And I think that's one of the interesting things that's coming through in this panel is the ways in which housing rights can only be reached if you bring together a number of actors. And the role of intermediation here becomes quite important. So we're going to move now to our next speaker. We are moving north to Spain. We are going to have Paco Morote, who is a spokesperson from the Plataforma de Afectados contra la Hipoteca, PA, which is a very famous citizen-led platform that grew out of the financial crisis in Spain. Was set up in 2009 and has now up to 226, I think, groups across Spain. So questions for Paco, I think the same question, what have been some of the most useful tactics that you have found? And I'm quite interested to hear from you this notion of the link between the legal and the rights dimension, and then also how you are seeing your tactics potentially changing in a changing context. So to you, Paco, thank you.
Hola, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por esta invitación. Y bueno, nuestra táctica siempre estuvo vinculada a 4 aspectos fundamentales. En primer lugar, el más urgente, obviamente, era el de ayudar a la gente. Y para eso lo que teníamos que hacer, lo que hicimos fue empoderarla. Hacerles ver que ni eran culpables ni son culpables de su situación y que además que tienen ese derecho a la vivienda. En segundo lugar, ejercíamos una presión potente y ejercemos una presión potente tanto sobre la banca privada como sobre las administraciones públicas, porque son las responsables de las leyes. También denunciamos que la situación por la que atravesaba la gente era una situación consecuencia de la legislación, de las leyes que teníamos en vigor, y que esas leyes las aprobaban los políticos. Por tanto, empezamos también a presionar a los políticos. Hacíamos scratches, por supuesto, siempre desde un punto de vista radicalmente pacífico, pero sí presionante y denunciante. Es decir, les presionábamos diciendo, ustedes pueden, pero no quieren. Ustedes, por su inacción o por su acción, esta gente está siendo desahuciada. Y bueno, eso ha sido, y por supuesto es fundamental dar mucha visibilidad a los conflictos y hacer, o sea, todo este tipo de actuaciones estratégicas o tácticas y tal, lo que nos permitían era que el conjunto de la sociedad fuera consciente del problema existente y lo asumiera como propio, porque todo el mundo tenía a alguien cercano que se había visto afectado por un desahucio o por una situación parecida. En consecuencia también, y puesto que estábamos denunciando la legislación, tengo que decir que los 2 únicos intentos, porque en España no existe una ley estatal de vivienda, a pesar de que en la Constitución el artículo 47 reconoce ese derecho, pero sin embargo no hay una ley estatal de vivienda que garantice unos mínimos, sino que la competencia en materia de vivienda es de cada una de las comunidades autónomas, con lo cual a la desigualdad social, ¿no? En función del nivel de renta disponible que ya existe, se añade la desigualdad del territorio en donde vives. Somos los 2 únicos intentos de una ley estatal de vivienda, los hemos llevado al Congreso desde la plataforma Afectados por la Hipoteca. Una en 2013 con una iniciativa legislativa popular y otra en 2018. Ni que decir tiene que ambas fueron derrotadas, pero también hemos tenido victorias importantes. En 2015, mediante también una iniciativa legislativa popular en el territorio de Cataluña, se aprobó la Ley 24/2015, que es una de las mayores, de las que mejor protegen a nivel europeo el derecho a la vivienda, y fue fruto precisamente de la lucha de la paz, y es una ley que todavía está en vigor. Sin embargo, como digo, existen notables diferencias en función del territorio en el que se vive. Aquí los desahucios no han desaparecido, a pesar de que aparentemente hay un gobierno más sensible. Sin embargo, estamos denunciando que solo en el tiempo que va, en los días que van desde el 4 hasta el 30 de junio, que son los únicos días que han estado los juzgados activos porque estaban cerrados como consecuencia del confinamiento, el estado de alarma por la pandemia, solo en esos 27 días se han producido en España 1.383 desahucios. 1.383 en 23 días, en 27 días, perdón. Y bueno, esto va a seguir así, y en esta tesitura, pues nosotros hemos reclamado varias cosas. Hemos reclamado, en primer lugar, una moratoria de todos los desahucios hasta el 31 de diciembre de 2021, teniendo en cuenta pues, las consecuencias, porque hemos hablado de la crisis pasada, pero la pandemia está generando una brutal crisis económica, pues casi tan potente como la anterior. En segundo lugar, hemos reclamado porque en la crisis anterior hubo un rescate a la banca, un rescate que se saldó con 60.000 millones de euros que el Banco de España da por perdidos, y nosotros decimos que no se pueden dar por perdidos. Y no solo lo decimos nosotros, sino que estamos convencidos de que el conjunto de la sociedad está con nosotros y que la banca, que dispone de enormes cantidades de vivienda, debiera cederla para uso temporal como parque público. Porque ha habido un tema que habéis comentado, que es el tema de la vivienda pública como solución. La vivienda pública es imprescindible. Si no hay vivienda pública, no hay acceso a la vivienda. La vivienda, como bien ha planteado en primer lugar, luego lo ha repetido algunos otros intervinientes, pero nuestra querida amiga Raquel Ronick, la vivienda está cosificada, es un mero bien de consumo más, como un lápiz, como un ordenador o como un cepillo de dientes. Y nosotros hemos reclamado en la situación de pandemia que no solamente la condición de bien social para la vivienda, hemos reclamado, hemos exigido también la condición de bien de salud pública, puesto que nos han confinado en las casas a los que tenemos casas. Pues resulta que en plena pandemia hemos tenido que parar desahucios. Es decir, cuando se nos dice que tenemos que permanecer en nuestros domicilios, ponen a gente en la calle. Además, se ha desatado este verano una curiosa campaña por parte de la derecha política en España, denunciando el tema de la ocupación. Y aquí no tenemos vivienda pública. Es decir, mientras que en los países de la Unión Europea hay una media que suele rondar entre el 14 al 18% de vivienda pública para alquiler asequible, aquí en España apenas superamos el 2%. Sin embargo, según la estadística oficial del Instituto Nacional de Estadística, hay 3,5 millones de casas desocupadas. Cuando estamos además en situación de pandemia, la gente tiene que optar entre vivir en la calle u ocupar una de estas viviendas. Además, la inmensa mayoría de esas viviendas son propiedad o bien de la banca o bien de fondos buitre que han desembarcado en nuestro país y que además los mantienen conscientemente y especuladoramente fuera de mercado para así hacer subir los precios de los que sí tienen en mercado. Y acabo, porque parece que me ibas a llamar la atención. Vale, acabo. Es fundamental. Es muy importante y se ha comentado también, es decir, la vivienda no solamente está considerada, es un mero bien de consumo, no. Lo más grave que tiene la vivienda y lo que desde nuestro punto de vista atenta más gravemente contra el derecho a la vivienda es que es un bien de financiación de las entidades financieras, es un bien de financiación de la banca. Recordar que la crisis de 2007 se inició con las hipotecas subprimes. Entonces, por eso la banca tiene tanta participación y los fondos buitres. Por lo tanto, tenemos que hacer que eso salga de ahí, que eso deje de ser objetivo prioritario de esa financiación. Y muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Paco. And sorry to have to press you on such an important issue indeed. So thank you again for sharing this experience and really shining the light on the responsibility of the state actually in being able to address these issues and potentially shift some of the paradigms upon which they operate and they conceive of housing. And so now Eduard Cabré is in this potentially unenviable position to have to speak on behalf of local governments. But here you have a really interesting experiment going on in Barcelona. And I think really interesting for us to understand what it means for a local government that takes housing rights seriously, indeed that built its sort of its political message around taking housing rights much more seriously. I think we're all keen to understand the opportunities this brings and the challenges too in this rather difficult international context that was sketched earlier on. So to you.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for having me here. I'm going to be speaking in English since I didn't know I could do it in Spanish when I prepared some of my notes. I'm very happy to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces. So this really feels like a family reunion to me. I'm here as an independent consultant to the housing department at the city of Barcelona, even though a few months ago I was still working at the Global Platform for the Right to the City. And in both capacities, I participated in the launch of the Cities for Adequate Housing Declaration that many cities and civil society organizations signed and launched together. And as a result of that movement, so to speak, within UCLG, we set a community of practice on housing where several cities meet to discuss their current challenges. And also as part of that community of practice, we try to engage civil society groups. And so this call for me is just or yet another opportunity to continue exchanging with civil society groups. So I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the approach that Barcelona has been taking on housing. I'm glad that Paco already gave you the overall context in Spain in terms of the challenges resulting from the financial crisis, but also the most recent ones. But I want to tell you a little bit about how in Barcelona the city has been trying to really implement from the ground up housing rights in the city. And to do that, we approved the Barcelona Right to Housing Plan, which is a 10-year plan. I'm just going to very quickly tell you about the 4 axes that this plan includes to give you an idea of the approach that we are taking. The first axis looks at preventing and addressing housing emergency, because even if we want to have a long-term impact and change the paradigm, we realized there were very short-term needs that we couldn't just forget about. And so in order to respond to those needs, the city increased rental allowances. During these few years, we've been increasing them year after year. We also set a unit against residential exclusion, which is a unit of social workers and other experts that support people facing eviction. So in a way, what Paco was telling you about supporting families in need, the city here tried to emulate some of the work that PA and other groups were doing on the ground as civil society within the institution, so that the city could also be there, in person when evictions were taking place, but also even before in trying to prevent them, of course. And we've also been pushing for rent regulation, and this is something that I'm going to be telling you later on. The second big axis that the plan included was an attempt to guarantee the social function of housing. As you probably know, many constitutions, including the Spanish one, recognizes housing and property to have a social function intrinsic to them. And so in order to make that a reality, in Barcelona, the city and the metropolitan government created a housing observatory to have actual data that showed us where the needs were and how the different municipalities within the metropolitan area were responding to those needs. And based on that data, we started to implement what we call housing discipline. That is, we used all of our abilities through urban planning laws, as well as other regulations, to impose sanctions and other legal actions to ensure that vacant housing, illegal touristic apartments, and other situations like harassment situations where the city had a legal reasoning to act. We used that ability to make sure that housing really was taken as a right. Third axis was to increase the social and affordable housing stock, and so we've been investing a lot more in building housing. We've been partnering with cooperatives and other social housing developers to do more in terms of quantity of housing. And the fourth axis has been to improve the existing stock. That means investing in housing renovation and also introducing some anti-speculative and anti-gentrification measures to make sure that renovation does not mean eviction, right? There's always this tension, so we've been working on that. The big challenge that we're facing right now is the crisis that the COVID-19 and the whole pandemic and this situation has created. There is clearly more pressure in terms of short-term needs. And in order to respond to that pressure, there've been some short-term emergency measures that have been put in place. There's been a national moratorium on evictions and an extension of rental contracts. There's been a reduction in public housing rents and also soft loans for tenants, temporary shelter for the homeless, and a national minimum living income. So very progressive measures that we hope have come to stay. But there's also the need to really speed up on structural reforms. So in Barcelona, but also working with the regional government in Catalonia and the national government in Spain, we're working to introduce rent regulation, which we've succeeded in doing in Catalonia and hopefully will also happen in the rest of Spain. We've also introduced in Catalonia permanent affordability in social housing. And finally, and this is very important for local governments at this point, at the EU level, there's this next generation EU package that the European Union will support national governments in investing a lot more in sustainability, but also in housing and infrastructures that are vital to changing the sustainability path that we are into in terms of climate change, but also in terms of social sustainability. So really our focus at this point is in trying to make sure that civil society groups and local governments work together in putting pressure on national governments to put money where it's needed, to put priorities where they're needed. And so I think there is a lot of synergies that we can work on together, local governments and civil society. Sorry for having to speed up, but thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Eduardo. And it's, again, very sorry to have to make you hurry up because a lot of really interesting instruments that you were describing, but beyond the instrument also, I think what is very interesting is the story of the political connection between local authorities and social movements. And that takes time to unpack and explain how that can grow and what are potential tensions, but also how they can be nurtured. So I think with that, I'd love to pass the floor now to Lorena Zarata, who is a co-coordinator of the support team for the Global Platform for the Right to the City. She's also, as many of you here will know, ex-president of HIC. And Lorena, maybe you can help us situate some of these cases that we've been discussing and put them in a broader context. Help us understand also a little bit the synergies between the various actors that we've been talking, whose voices we've heard. And there's a lot of questions in the chats, which unfortunately we don't really have time to address, but some of them are around these issues of how these questions of rights actually is embedded or immersed within questions of governance. So again, if you can maybe try and talk about that when you have an international or comparative perspective. And there's an interesting question here, which is in this trying to change the language and or bring back reclaim the notion of housing as rights. Somebody had mentioned, Hillary had mentioned the role of the media, and somebody in the chat is saying, but actually the media is often an enemy of this kind of reframing. So I know that you and I had in the past discussed about the role of the media in these increasingly polarized debates around housing rights. So maybe it's something you want to bring up, but there's a lot, so please do what you can do in 5 minutes.
Gracias, Bárbara. Aprovechando que hay traducción, voy a hablar en español. Bueno, gracias Adriana, gracias a las organizaciones promotoras de este evento por la invitación. Es por supuesto un placer poder participar en esta importante discusión. Ya se han dicho muchas cosas muy relevantes, ¿no? Y se han señalado muchos de los elementos centrales, creo, tanto de los avances que ha habido como de los retrocesos, ¿no? Y de los grandes desafíos que enfrentamos. Sin duda ha sido un periodo, estos 20 años ha sido un periodo de muchísimos cambios. Y no solo eso, sino muy acelerados. Me gustaría enfatizar algunas cosas, quizá tratando de responder un poco, complementar algunas cosas que se han dicho y señalar tal vez algunos elementos que no se han mencionado todavía, muy rápidamente. El primero, creo que queda claro en las presentaciones de nuestras compañeras y compañeros que ha habido una profundización desde las organizaciones sociales, en particular los movimientos urbanos, los movimientos de reclamo por el derecho a la tierra, etcétera. Una multiplicación y una profundización de las estrategias que se usan. Y sin duda existían estas estrategias antes, pero me parece que ahora hay una intencionalidad, hay un uso explícito de combinar esas distintas estrategias. ¿Y eso qué quiere decir? Bueno, por supuesto, organización y movilización comunitaria y social amplia, incluyendo la movilización de la opinión pública en general, instrumentos para la formación, la capacitación, la sensibilización, etcétera. Y aquí señalar no solo de las comunidades y de las comunidades afectadas y de las personas afectadas, también de las instituciones, también de las y los funcionarios públicos. Y esto ha sido parte de un proceso intencionado también. No alcanza con capacitar a nuestras comunidades. Tenemos que cambiar las instituciones y la forma en que las instituciones operan. Y eso también se ha estado haciendo. Por supuesto, todo el nivel de la incidencia en políticas públicas, de las propuestas para política pública que vienen de las organizaciones, y esto incluye desde cambios constitucionales en varios países, como en el caso de Bolivia, Ecuador, etcétera, para incluir el derecho a la vivienda, en muchos casos el derecho a la ciudad, pero la modificación también de políticas y la propuesta de leyes, las iniciativas populares de leyes para modificar el marco jurídico existente. Y por supuesto, también dentro de eso, el uso de los instrumentos de la legalidad, pero diría yo también ahí, tensionando y ampliando qué significa la legalidad, y usando instrumentos de formación o de legalidad popular, digamos, ¿no? Y de paralegalidad que se conoce en algunos casos. Y creo que esto es fundamental, ¿no? No solamente empoderarse y conocer lo que hay, sino expandir los límites de eso también desde las comunidades. Y formatos alternativos, el uso de tribunales populares, por ejemplo, para denunciar casos, para exigir que se tomen medidas, etc. Me parece que esto es muy importante. Dentro de eso, decir que tenemos que tener presente, y esto también en diálogo con el panel anterior, el enfoque de derechos humanos, el enfoque de derechos económicos, sociales y culturales, no solamente nos dice el qué es importante, también nos dice el cómo llegar ahí. Y el cómo no llegar y cómo no violar esos derechos. Y creo que esto es importante resaltarlo, ¿no? Hay instrumentos claros, hay parámetros claros de qué no hacer. Y una cosa que ha cambiado mucho en estos años es el rol del sector privado y el rol del sector privado transnacional y corporativo. Y como sabemos, el enfoque de derechos tiene limitaciones frente a eso todavía, porque está centrado en los estados y en las responsabilidades de los estados, y todavía muy poco en términos de regular el rol del sector privado y en particular el rol del sector transnacional, que cada vez más está impactando la vida de nuestras comunidades, tanto urbanas como rurales, tanto en el sur como en el norte, ¿no? Y hay pocos instrumentos para esto todavía. Ahí es donde ha habido innovación y ahí es donde la movilización conjunta de la sociedad civil, de las comunidades con los gobiernos locales, que ven que ni los gobiernos nacionales ni las instituciones multilaterales están tomando el rol que deben tomar en ese sentido, ha habido avances. Y la declaración que se menciona de Ciudades por la Vivienda, por ejemplo, muestra un poco el sentido de esos esfuerzos, de cómo los gobiernos locales necesitan juntarse además en red, en solidaridad, para negociar frente a estos y poner un alto a las acciones de estos actores transnacionales. Me parece que ahí hay mucho que avanzar todavía. Y lo otro que diría es que me parece que lo que ha habido, o lo que falta desarrollar más, es un discurso, las dos cosas, un discurso y una práctica de los sectores progresistas institucionales. Creo que los partidos políticos progresistas, los sindicatos, incluso las universidades y otras instituciones públicas se han quedado atrás en muchos de estos discursos y en muchas de estas prácticas y han sido víctimas del mantra neoliberal y de dejar, ¿no?, que el mercado haga y el desmantelamiento del Estado que nos señalaba Raquel al inicio. Hoy se abre no solo la oportunidad, sino la necesidad urgente de cambiar eso. Las crisis anteriores, las crisis que traíamos y que se profundizan, social y económica, el cambio climático y ahora la crisis sanitaria, ponen en el centro la urgencia no solamente de lo público y de fortalecer lo público y el rol de la vivienda en eso, sino de reimaginar lo público y reimaginar lo público en una gestión comunitaria, en una gestión participativa. Creo que hay muchos elementos ahí y sin duda saldrán más de los siguientes debates. Gracias.
Lorena, thank you so much. Again, such a difficult task to try and respond in such a short period of time, but I think really putting the point on the need that we need to, in this current moment, we need to find really different solutions to the one we had in previous times of crisis. So thanks for, again, bringing the urgency to the table. I think we're going to move now to the next panel. If that's, I want to thank everybody, of course, for your participation and for your playing the game of trying to speak in such a short period of time. It's a challenge.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Welcome to panel 2.2. As we have seen, well, my name is Yolanda Hendler. I am with the Habitat International Coalition, HIC. And as was mentioned in the previous panel, this conversation is really about seeking the convergence of different ways of realizing housing rights. We have been listening to examples of claiming rights on the ground in the face of violations, seeking redress, engaging in popular education and various other approaches. And now in this particular panel, we will take a closer look at organizations and people who are working on producing habitat rights on a daily basis. What does it look like to slowly and incrementally build and strengthen that collective social and political muscle, that everyday action and organizing to find ways of holding governments more accountable? Some practices of producing housing rights include land management and community land administration, community-led financing approaches, construction of habitat through the social production of habitat, managing habitat through community land trusts, co-ops, and associations. And in each of these avenues, rights are advanced through a set of relationships. So in this sense, the claiming of rights is very connected to the production of rights. And so with the help of the 4 organizations in this panel, we will hear about tactics for producing housing rights. And as in the previous panel, we have 2 questions in which each speaker will be centering their response on. And the first one is, what is working well in your current practice? And then secondly, what are the challenges that you are experiencing in your organizing practices that affect how you are able to realize housing rights? So I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Rose Molokwane. She is the national coordinator and founding member of the Federation of the Urban and Rural Poor in South Africa, which is affiliated with Slum Dwellers International, SDI, Rose is for many years, Rose has been been a member on the management committee of Slum Dwellers International. So Rose, I would like to pass the floor to you with a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Yolande, for inviting me to be part of the panelists of this wonderful discussion that is happening today. As you have introduced me, I've been with this organization for almost 30 years. What this organization is looking at, yes, we understand that we have right to housing, but with us, we also said we should have responsibilities for ourselves to achieve this housing. We have the tactics that we have used. The most important tactic is to connect the communities and to educate each other on how to identify challenges that are affecting us in daily basis, and also coming up with solutions on how to address these challenges that we are having. We've got the tools that we are using in order for us to connect amongst each other as communities. We are using savings driven by us to our daily needs. Why we became Shack Dwellers International, exchange programs that are being used became a very strong tool that helped us to know each other, to learn from each other, to share experiences of what is happening in our different areas of operation. Hence, we managed to organize over 33 countries that make us to connect to each other as ordinary community people. We have agreed that savings is a very strong tool that can be used as a leverage to attract more funding in order to address the issues of homelessness, landlessness, and addressing the poverty that is affecting all our communities. We can't do anything if we don't do it on our own. We can't do anything if we don't look out and support each other. What is happening right now is that the savings has helped our people to start their businesses, also to improve their existing businesses. Our savings has helped us to build our own houses. Our savings has helped us to acquire land for ourselves. But most importantly, our savings has helped us to know how to influence the policies of government. That is why today in many of our countries, we've got partnerships with municipalities and national governments. And we were able to also influence different policies, especially housing policies, that created a space for our national government to create a space for engagement between themselves and ourselves. We were successful until the pandemic came into existence. The coronavirus affected our process so much that we started to dwindle our savings. We started to see our saving groups dying a little bit, maybe because of the regulations that were put to our communities to say, we have to stay home, we have to wash our hands, we have to have social distancing, we have to take care of ourselves. But because of all these regulations, it was difficult for us to continue promoting the culture of savings. It was difficult for us to continue with our exchange programs. It was difficult for us to collect our data. Why it was difficult for savings? Because we used to have our door-to-door exercise, visit each other, collecting the savings from our different households. It was difficult because the data that we collected was a tool that helped us to engage with different government and municipalities. But now, because of the pandemic, we were having a serious challenge of achieving solutions to our problems. What we did, you know, right now, as I'm participating on this Zoom meeting, we also started to say, let's communicate amongst each other using the Zoom system. Our leadership got educated on how to use the Zoom system. And that's how we started to connect each other bit by bit. We started to say, let's revive ourselves. Bit by bit, we said to ourselves, those who can afford to continue saving should continue, and then we'll communicate telephonically amongst each other. For now, we are busy rebuilding our organizations. We are busy rebuilding our SDI. We are challenging the challenges that are brought forward to us by the pandemic. And then we are getting successful. We only need to join hands with all of you who are participating here to start to support what we are doing technically and financially, because as I said earlier, we use our savings as a leverage to attract resources that can help us to change our lives. Housing is a right, but it can be a right if it doesn't have responsibilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, particularly for sharing what happens when your mobilizing tactics are so reliant on face-to-face connection. And that kind of connection actually is made, rendered impossible through the COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to pass the floor now to Sonia Fadrigo, who is a community leader and founding member of the Homeless People's Federation of the Philippines. The Homeless People's Federation is a member of the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, and Sonia's current position is as regional coordinator for Western Visayas. And the question particularly to Sonia is, what has everyday organizing and mobilizing meant for building relationships with local authorities, and what has worked particularly well in the current context, but what challenges have you experienced in your practice?
Good evening, everyone. It's already evening in the Philippines, so maybe it's still daytime in your place. I would like to share our experience in the Philippines on how we produce our housing rights. So our experience in the past and until now, whenever evictions come to communities, we feel so helpless and hopeless. And when you ask help from the government, they will always say no land available for resettlement, to the point where they will blame us, saying, it's your fault. You build your house in the land that doesn't belong to you. This kind of situation made us realize that we have to strategize. How can government look at us on a different perspective rather than demanding and forcing them to provide us land for housing? With the help of our NGO, we organize ourselves, like Rose is saying, into savings group. We capacitate ourselves by understanding and learning what policy that provides us our terms of engagement to the government. And through our savings, we're able to negotiate and buy land and learn the process of collective housing and ownership. This experience was also shared with other communities who are facing the same problems with ours. It is then that we decided to form a network of communities citywide, meaning the whole city, to be able to have one voice with one goal. We realized that we need information about our settlement. So we ourselves initiated survey and mapping, where we can generally get and consolidate issues that confront all of us. And we're able to identify and prioritize our upgrading needs in addition to securing land tenure. We implemented small, yeah?
So to interrupt, could you turn your camera on just briefly?
Yeah, because my signal is not so good, so it may be, so sorry, yeah, I'm using my phone.
Okay.
Okay. So we realized that we need information about our informal settlements. So we ourselves initiated survey and mapping where we can generally get and consolidate issues that confront all of us. We were able to identify our upgrading needs, and in addition to securing our land tenure, we implemented small-scale community upgrading projects in informal settlements like concreting of pathwalks, community streetlights, communal water system, and among others. These were supported by ACHR. The self-help community-led process and upgrading initiatives that we're doing was finally recognized by the government. And because we are a network of communities, big numbers matters for them, especially for supporting them during elections. So this is again political. That started the opening of doors for us. We are now given space to participate in local special bodies and technical working groups that were created by the government. To date, for almost 15 years, we are an active partner of the city towards the formulation and approval of the city shelter plan, annual investment plan, local development council, and we also sit in the local housing board, and we're able to somehow become part of the decision-making process of the city in general. Today, we don't need to buy land because government has resettlement site for those affected by court-ordered eviction, infrastructure projects, families affected by disasters. With the support of our international partners, we're able to demonstrate and implement low-cost community-managed housing project using alternative materials like cement bamboo frames and interlocking compressed earth blocks. Because we're involved and have knowledge in almost all of the development plans of the city, we can use this information to strategically plan ahead and inform and organize communities for this development. For example, we know in 5 years where will be the next big reclamation project that will be affecting shoreline communities that needs housing. To sum up all of this, we have community data where we have information about settlements, we have established citywide networks in numbers, we have community savings and community managed resources, we have community upgrading projects, and we have housing projects that demonstrate low-cost community managed housing. Given this partnership and collaboration with the government that is ongoing until now, we have encountered a lot of challenges and frustrations. Number one is the changes in political environment, as usual, where we always have to start from scratch, no matter how we try to institutionalize and sustain this existing engagement that we have, especially in the issue of land and housing. In our community upgrading projects, the government or barangays see communities as competition rather than complementing what they can provide, because community managed upgrading projects cost is much lower compared to government doing it. While the survey and data that we have is only used in the local planning process, and it is not considered official data with regards to budget allocation for the national government. Currently, in this situation with the COVID pandemic, the national government steers the wheel of making regulations and implementing protocols and guidelines. It has to be implemented by the local government. It is sad to note that local government don't tap local communities or organized communities like us to help in this crisis. It seems local voices is not being invited to be part of the solution again. Instead, the top-down approach and decision-making is again happening. They should acknowledge that organized communities can help stop the spread of the virus. Organized communities has internal governance structure to be able to facilitate and help police members who are not wearing face masks, for example, or even community-based hand washing stations can be counterpart of these communities. It's very frustrating that we have engaged them and have been visible to them for many years, doing many things, demonstrate our capacities. Yet again, we are just treated as beneficiary of relief goods in this crisis. In closing, we are used to this kind of treatment. We have to strategize again and lobby how we can help in this global crisis that we're facing now. A crisis like this should not prevent us still from being the owner of our own lives. So we have to get involved and continue to engage, whether we like it or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that input detailing the amount of time that goes into relationship building, community organizing, and how a change in political environment can really negatively affect those very carefully crafted relationships over time. I would like to hand the floor now to Silvia Emanueli, who is the coordinator of HIC in Latin America, and she is based in Mexico and will be speaking more about the social production of habitat. Silvia, the floor is yours. Silvia, I think we're having trouble hearing you, at least I am.
¿Me escuchan? Sí. ¿Así me escuchan? Ok, perfecto. Perdón, voy a hablar en español ya que está la traducción y para cambiar un poco de idioma. Me han pedido de hablar de producción social del hábitat, que sería más una estrategia, digamos, que una táctica, por ser de largo alcance. Bueno, recordar que más del 60% de las viviendas de América Latina se han construido por autoconstrucción. Y por lo tanto, desde el siglo pasado, a través de cientos de ensayos, experiencias, pilotos, intercambios, sistematizaciones, escuelas populares y espacios de teorización colectiva, nuestras organizaciones miembros, pero también muchísimos aliados, han ido construyendo juntas el concepto de producción social del hábitat, que identifica aquellos procesos que generan espacios habitables, que generan viviendas bajo el control de autoproductores que operan sin fines de lucro. Y en estas articulaciones se ha incidido para también el reconocimiento de esta forma de producción en legislaciones, políticas y presupuestos. Y se han hecho obviamente una serie de peleas relacionadas como por ejemplo peleas para obtener el derecho al suelo para población empobrecida. La producción social del hábitat, como demuestra una reciente publicación que elaboramos, que se llama Utopías en Construcción, creemos que sigue teniendo gran vigencia, tanto política como práctica. La producción social se plantea como un proceso alternativo y viable al modelo de vivienda de mercado, pero también el que ha sido desarrollado por parte del Estado bajo una óptica de vivienda social llave en manos, que no contempla, como sabemos, la participación de los habitantes y que muchas veces tampoco garantiza el derecho a una vivienda adecuada. En los procesos de producción social del hábitat, en cambio, tenemos la oportunidad de construir comunidad, de ensayar autogestión y eventualmente incluso plantear propiedad colectiva que nos permite defender con más contundencia los territorios populares de la embestida del mercado. Y muchísimas veces esta forma de producción es la única alternativa para convertir en realidad el acceso al derecho a la vivienda por parte de o para muchísimas personas. En México los datos nos indican, por ejemplo, que el 76% de la población queda excluida de la vivienda social o de mercado. Por lo tanto, fíjense ustedes qué importancia puede adquirir esta forma de producción alternativa para la cual pedimos al Estado también presupuesto. Esta es la pelea, reconocer que esa forma de producción sirve para satisfacer un derecho que le toca al Estado y por lo tanto hay que apoyarla. Muchas experiencias en los últimos años hemos visto que no han aportado solo soluciones al problema habitacional, sino que se han caracterizado por ensayar también prácticas muy interesantes, transformadoras, les hemos llamado, en lo social, en lo económico, en lo cultural y en lo ambiental, que es un tema que quizás estaba un poco olvidado o no central en el siglo pasado, pero que hoy con mucha fuerza también ha sido incluido en las preocupaciones de los productores sociales. Podríamos, por lo tanto, decir que quizás todavía se trata de proyectos utópicos, porque sus promotores se empeñan día con día en construir lo que parecería imposible dentro de las condiciones del sistema capitalista, pero construyen justamente espacios de esperanzas donde premia el interés colectivo. Y sí creemos que tienen estas experiencias mucho que enseñar, incluso en el marco del mundo que queremos construir post pandemia. Para concluir, seguramente tenemos muchos desafíos. La producción social, cuando llegan gobiernos conservadores al poder, muchas veces deciden cortar recursos para este tipo de producción. Esto está pasando, por ejemplo, en Brasil, incluso durante la pandemia. Pero también en el caso de gobiernos que son progresistas, como el de México, que está dando centralidad a la producción social, muchas veces no se logra fácilmente hacer dialogar esta forma de producción con las exigencias burocráticas, digamos, y los tiempos, por ejemplo, de la Secretaría de Hacienda. Entonces, bueno, los temas son muchos, ya se ha hablado también de la dificultad de crecer de escala, pero creemos que son semillas de futuro. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for sharing that important strategic approach, which actually gives us insight on the how and some more details on the how question that was raised earlier. Our last panelist in this session is Leah Oswald. She is project manager for the NGO Obermond Swiss, based in Geneva. She is overseeing cooperation projects in Latin America and Asia in the field of community-led housing, with a special focus on the housing cooperative model. Leah will be speaking to us about how the Uruguayan Federation of Mutual Aid Housing Cooperatives organizes through popular education. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to participate to this panel. So yeah, I was asked to speak about housing cooperative as a good practice to realize the right to adequate housing. And at Urbamond, it is one of the main collaborative and community-led housing model that we are documenting and supporting through different projects. I think most of you are familiar with housing cooperatives, and it will also echo to Sylvia's presentation. And you know that when housing cooperatives have the right legal framework, public support and technical assistance, they have proven to be a very efficient way to provide secure, affordable, participative and anti-speculative housing, and also to create strong and resilient communities. And there are many examples all around the world, and also a great diversity of formats, which makes this model actually interesting because it can be adapted to different contexts and needs. In some countries like Switzerland, for example, the housing cooperative model has been implemented more than a century ago and is today one of the main providers of social housing, while in other countries like in Central America, it is yet emerging and struggling to get the right support. And regarding the formats, some housing co-ops are rented, others are resident-owned, some are townhouses or small buildings, some are larger buildings with hundreds of units, some are more or less participative through the whole process of planning, building, managing, etc. So there is a great diversity, but they all share the same fundamental values such as self-help, equality, equity, and solidarity, and they are all people-centered, jointly owned and democratically controlled, which means one member and one vote to make the decisions. And I wanted to focus here on one specific example of a housing cooperative model in order to highlight one of their inspiring practices and the related challenges they are facing. So actually, since 2016, Urbamond has been collaborating with the Uruguayan Federation of Mutual Aid Housing Cooperatives through an international cooperation project. The mutual aid housing cooperatives are one specific model in the landscape of housing cooperatives in Uruguay. They are a rental and collective ownership model based on 4 principles, which are direct democracy, self-help, collective ownership, and mutual aid. They exist since 1968, and the National Federation was created in 1970. And today the Federation counts around 600 cooperatives that are members, which represents more than 20,000 households. Their main characteristic is the mutual aid, which means that the future residents will participate in building the housing units, contributing through their work to a 15% of the global cost of the project. This way, this model is aimed more particularly at low-income people, as there is no need to have previous savings, and it becomes an alternative to traditional public social housing. And through this self-building process, actually they start building strong communities by creating social links and involvement. But it might not be enough. So how to build stronger communities is actually one of the major challenges for the cooperative movement today, and how to create involvement in the social and political movement, and how to give the right tools to the residents to build their communities based on solidarity, democracy, and justice. So an inspiring practice to tackle this challenge was for them to create in 2013 the National School for Mutual Aid Housing Cooperatives. The school aims at developing popular education methods adapted to their specific housing cooperative model. It's an open, free, and dynamic school that allows discussion exchange, learning, and putting into practice at the same time. The trainers are members of the housing cooperatives, and they work all on a voluntary basis. The mission of the school is to bring the residents to think about their own practice through trainings about the cooperative model and through spaces for debate and discussion about broader societal topics. So the final objective being for the residents to become cooperativists and social activists who have the tools to analyze the reality in which they live from the point of view of solidarity. So education and trainings is not only fundamental to get the technical and organizational knowledge to implement and manage a housing cooperative, but also to strengthen the social aspect of a cooperative housing project. And this seems to be one of the major challenges today in order to build also a stronger social movement, which will be able to advocate for their interest and being able to grow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah, for that. I will hand over to Alexandri Apsan-Frediani to comment on this very interesting panel of contributions. Just perhaps to highlight a couple of questions that have been shared in the chat that you could possibly touch on is a discussion on finance and the role of donors in the structural context of dismantling the welfare state. There was a question also on whether the sessions will be recorded, and they are, so we will share them in time, but since we are running over time, I will share. I will hand over to Alex.
Great, thank you for the questions. I mean, I would try to summarize some of the issues that was brought up, and it's a fantastic session and conversation. I think I would like to start just by highlighting this point that the various speakers are saying, that housing rights are being advanced through the production of housing itself. This is yet another space of claiming for rights through the actual production of houses by, say, the collective savings, by the accessing land, by the way that communities are planning and designing, building and managing their houses through community collective processes, which in itself is expanding housing rights. And I think there are three different ways that housing rights are being expanded through the collective production of the community-led processes of housing that we've been hearing so far. First, as Leah was mentioning just now, community-led housing processes are advancing housing because they are addressing quite well the needs of communities on the grounds in terms of being responsive to their needs and aspirations. So in that sense, community-led processes enhances people's access to housing. Secondly, I think what Sylvia was describing from the social production of habitat in Latin America, it's quite incredible to see the production of housing in itself being a pedagogical process, a process of learning about each other's needs and aspirations, very much rooted in the concepts of Paulo Freire around conscientization and critical awareness to get to know about our social diversity, how different people experience housing, their needs, coming from issues around race, around gender. In the chat, there has been a few conversations around the racialized aspects of housing and how also the impacts of the financialization of housing and housing crisis. So capturing all of that aspect of social diversity and the pedagogical aspects of the collective process of housing is fundamental. And thirdly, what Rose described incredibly well about the work that SDI does, which is to actually build collective muscles. And also, Yolanda, you mentioned that in your introduction, that building houses together, saving together, managing land together can actually create the bonds of solidarity and collective action, and enhances the bargaining power to affect change, to also to fight against violations of human rights, and to find pathways to navigate the current circumstances. But also speakers brought up some very important challenges that we are facing today. And I think one of them is around this idea of how do you sustain that and secure that social function that community-led housing initiatives has been brought up. Sonia talked about the threat of this kind of instrumentalization of the state and start seeing communities as beneficiaries rather than equal partners in the processes of change. And I think this is an incredible risk in the long term, that kind of community-led processes become instrumentalized or just described as a kind of beneficiary approach. So, and on the other hand, how to avoid the integration of those housing collective community-led processes into a market that is very uneven and very exclusionary. So we might end up in a process of like unfavorable inclusion, which is very problematic. So retaining that social function is fundamental. And I think the last point that I just want to highlight is what you brought up, Yolanda, from the chat, which is the threat of financialization. We are seeing the closing down of possibilities to finance and to support community-led housing internationally. And we need to revigorate those efforts. We need to bring back the great initiatives that we've seen in the past, such as the ACA project, or even there are several different initiatives that also mentioned already today, of ways through which the architecture of policy, planning, and finance have been able in the past to support community-led housing processes. And we need to collectively build coalitions internationally to be able to bring back those initiatives and to claim back those possibilities of implementing community-led housing on the ground, because they are so crucial to expand our housing rights in the streets in the way that we experience in cities today. So looking forward to follow-up conversations from this panel, and that we can continue dialoguing around those issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. I can see, okay. So we are definitely over time, so I'm going to be super quick before we close the meeting. And of course, to first of all, thank you all the speakers for this amazing energy and candid way of sharing where we are in this struggle, and also for the audience, to the audience, for the very valuable comments. I just want to highlight two things. We had at the beginning, I think that throughout the whole session, we had, first of all, a huge level of commonality around the diagnosis. What are the challenges and what is changing in terms of the challenges and so on. So I think that, you know, what is a housing crisis is very clear and is very commonly defined by all of us. I think that there was an interesting provocation towards the beginning around whether we need to continue using the language and the terminology of rights. And I think that throughout the session, what I felt was much more, I mean, as we move through, a confirmation of the importance and the particular role of talking about rights, not just justice, not just struggles, but rights. And this is because in a way, this is a very strong reminder of the responsibilities of others, but also of the precarization of citizenship. So it's not just about housing violations, are not just about the precarization of housing conditions, but the precarization of citizenship and entitlements. And we need to keep that there. My second big conclusion is that, again, as we expected from the beginning, or we have a hint, the fights to defend, the struggles, the processes, the tactics, the strategies to defend rights, to claim them, and to produce them are, again, absolutely complementary. And we have seen in both an enormous constellation of house. So the house don't just live on, you know, on the construction of rights. There were so many examples as well as to how in many significant ways and very creative and innovative ways of claiming and defending rights on the ground in very grounded ways are also emerging. So as many of you highlighted, clearly what is changing the most here is a much richer universe in terms of the house than perhaps we had, definitely than we had 2 or 3 decades ago. And this richness of house, of ways of changing things, of ways of tackling housing rights is very much driven by civil society organization, whether in the form of grassroots federations of the urban poor, social movements, federations of cooperatives, and so on. I'm going to stop here because I know that the interpreters for once and many of you need to go. But I just want to say that this is to be continued. Our main intention, as I mentioned before, was to bring different communities of practice together, to listen to each other, to reflect together, and just to even become more permeable to, to how we are defining the struggles, how we are approaching them. So this is only the beginning. Until the next stop, many thanks to all.